Okay, welcome everybody. We are going to be doing a lunch and learn on the updated EF repository. That's the package that we use to fulfill the repository pattern in all of our projects. Should be pretty similar to the previous versions, the 1.0 versions. There are a few changes that I want to point out though. We'll jump into the meat of what we're actually doing here in a minute, but let's focus just a little bit on one of the big changes. So from the 1.0 version for the 2.0 version, rather than having a new iRepository instance that's a generic for each entity that you want to query on, we now just have one repository that does everything, and then the methods allow us to supply the generic type. So this cleans up a lot of our dependency injection. It cleans up a lot of the instances that have to get created. Overall, just makes it easier to use. So that's the one big change moving from 1.0 to 2.0. If you're starting with 2.0, you can ignore that. We can move on to just the project as it is. To start, we have, well, let's go over the structure first. We have a few different projects. This should look fairly familiar to anybody who has used our template or looked at any of our projects that exists. We have our main application, which is just in this case a program. It's a console application. We have a data application, which has the data context and then any entities that exist with it. And then of course we have some services. We have a user with the interface for the service and any types that go with that service. That could be anything that's a model, an enum, anything that goes with the service. Then we have the service itself, that is the implementation of that interface. Likewise for vehicle, we have the interface and the vehicle itself, and then the implementation of that interface. So shouldn't be anything too dissimilar, should be fairly straightforward. If this isn't familiar to you, then you'll probably want to be looking at an earlier video or something else to talk about our template and how things get set up. This isn't really the focus, but just to show you what we've got here. So to get into the beginning of this, we have our program over here, which has most of our, again, pretty common stuff. We have our service collection, we have adding of logging, some of our helper classes, we have our database context being added in. In this case, I'm using an in-memory database because I didn't want to have to spin up a SQL Server instance or something else just for the demo. So in-memory works just fine. You'd replace that with whatever you're using if need be. We then have our mapper configuration. This is going to be using AutoMapper, but we are looking at moving toward a different mapper. So don't necessarily copy this, but this does work for AutoMapper. Likewise there. We do also have our registrations of our repositories and services. We also have this worker, which does most of the work, and that's it for this. Anything that you're going to be working is going to be doing dependency injection, so get used to how this works. Again, this isn't the focus of this video, so I'm not going to spend any more time here, but this is all here and set up. The worker class here is where we're going to spend most of our time, or at least most of our work doing things. You can see to start we have our create items method. This is going to go ahead and call our create users, create vehicles. That's just going to put everything in our in-memory database, and we have some vehicle makes right there, some brands that we can choose from as we're creating our classes. Then we're going to actually do some filtering with our services, which are going to be using the database behind the scenes. This is a nice abstraction. We can depend on our services. We don't have to depend on the database, the repository itself. We can just worry about the services and let them do their work. This makes this far more testable, far more modular, because we can replace this service with some other service later on if we need to. We can use an in-memory database for testing and then use a proper SQL Server or something else database when running. So good abstractions. But we do have our user service here, and we're going to be calling, so once these users are created, we're going to try to retrieve some of that data. So here we have a get by ID async, and we're passing in an ID of 2. Let's go ahead and look at that service. Collapse all these for now. And we have, there we are, couldn't find the method. Get by ID async. This method here is going to be returning just the user. And we can see we're getting it by ID using the ID that was passed in, looking at the first or default. We're then using our mapper to map back to the user, and we're done, good to go. So in the old days, before we had this new system, what we would need to do is come in here to our user service and say, all right, I need to have, or even into here sometimes, I need to have a new class that's going to let me do some filtering. So I'm going to add a new class. I'm going to call it user extensions. And I'm going to make it a public static class. I'm going to use that to return an iQueryable of, and actually need to add a using statement for whoops, getting ahead of myself. All right, we're going to use a using statement. So now I can say db.user, so I get the user that I want and not the one that's a part of this service. And then I'm going to say by ID. Then I'm going to say I want this to be the iQueryable of our DB users. And finally, the ID that we want. First, I want to check to see if users is null. If it is, then go ahead and just return users because we're not going to do any work on it. If ID is null, don't know why I did that, then also, go ahead and return users. Otherwise, return our filtered query. And I should have this be nullable and that be nullable. All right, so a little bit of time, not honestly a ton of effort, but some time to get in here. We get this by ID that's going to head and go ahead and filter this out by user ID. Of course, we do have other properties that are a part of our user object. So we'd likely want to have one that's going to be by name, possibly. One where the created is going to be before or after a certain date, or possibly a date range. One where a modified thing. This session start here looks like it could be important as well. It's a time. So maybe we want to filter based on that. For each of those, we're going to have to come in and create extension methods that will allow us to do that filtering. The reason we want extension methods is that they make things much more composable and much more reusable. So in the user service over here, this by ID, yeah, that might potentially be one that I want to use here, but let's look at this get all async down here. Here we have a whole list of things that we could query, and they're all null, but this allows, are nullable, so I don't have to pass them in, but I guess not that means. They're all nullable, they're also all using default parameters, so I can pass in just the ones I want, rather than having to do something like, well, you know, if name equal null, then query equals queryable dot by name. By having these extensions, check to see if the things are null for us, then over here I can just come in and say I guess I only have the one, but dot by ID, there's the one we created, and you know, I'm not passing an ID into this method, but I could do something like that. I could also do something like that. I don't have to worry about whether or not these are null because the extension method is checking for me. But this by ID allows me to use it down here. I can use the same one up here. You know, there are a number of things that I can, or a number of places I can use it. And this is just a very trivial example with a very trivial set of properties that I can use those repeatedly and get the same functionality. So this is a lot more reusable than the .where blah, 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 and having to check nulls everywhere. I can just do it at the one place. But making these is time consuming and it can be a huge pain. So one of the new additions to our repository library, go ahead and delete this so that we don't think that we're using that one, is the addition of these filter methods. So notice I have by ID here still, and it knows what it is, but I just deleted that extension method. So where's that coming from? Well, up here in our data, wherever the DB context is, that's where it needs to be. I can look at my dependencies and notice we have these analyzers where one is now our EF repository and it's a generator. So generators allow us to create code that we don't have to write ourselves. So it's being created by the machine rather than by us. So I can look at the user one and notice that they are namespaced the same. So EFR.data efr.data. So the namespace is exactly the same as whatever this is. If I change the namespace of user, it'll change the namespace over here. So here I have my by ID. It's doing exactly the same thing. If query is null, throw new argument null exception. If value equals null, it just returns the query. Otherwise, we filter by the ID. This is one thing that's different than what I had. This is really what we want, because if that query is nullable, we really shouldn't be doing anything. That's more what we want to do. And actually, we could even do this and say, oh, I can't change it in here. Well, maybe that's something I'll add, but one thing we could do is say argument null exception dot throw if null, and then I can say name, whoops, there we go, something like that. So we could actually change the generator to use this syntax for us, so we don't have to do the checking anymore. But either way, it's generated code, so what do we care? And ultimately, that throw if null, that's using this, so or that's going to compile down to the same thing, so it shouldn't be any different. So we don't really need to do it, but it could be useful. Anyway, I also have other things, so like by ID greater than. So for an ID, this isn't terribly useful, but it'll do this for any int that's a part of our user. So let's come over here and let's just do public int score. Okay, well now I should be able to come down here to the bottom and I have score. So it actually does it that fast, which is pretty cool. So by score, if I want to look for the exact value, by score greater than, if I want to get some high score or something, or top 10, score greater than or equal, score less than or equal. Okay, so, and I can do ranges, so I could do by score greater than or equal whatever dot by score less than or equal whatever, and get a range by doing it that way. So, but all this code is generated for us. We have the ID. We also have other data types. We have name and phone. So we have by name is null. So we don't pass a value in. We just, wherever name is null. By name is not null. So wherever it's not null, then I can get is null or white space, is not null or white space, then by the proper value if I want to check exactly. Then I can say by name contains if I want to look to see does it contain this. By name starts with, by name ends with, and then the same thing for phone. And you can see these are ordered in the same order. So ID, name, phone, ID, name, phone. When I added score, it was at the bottom. So that should make it easier to find if you ever need to look inside the generated code to find something. We also have date times, date time offsets, date only, time only, all of the date things will exist here. So we have date created, and we can check to see if that's equal, if it's before or after or between. Check only by on date. So if we don't want the time component for date time, if we look at the date only piece, this has modified, which is a date only. So date only if they're equal, greater than or equal, less than or equal, before, after, between. Okay, so each of these are the same as the date times, but they don't have the by date because obviously it's date only. So don't need to do that. We can come back into here now. So we can use all these if I wanted to do something like this in the filtering. So I can say dot by name. I'm actually saying contains in this case because if it's equal, then great. Dot by phone contains dot created, or by created is what I wanted. And let's say just by created in this case. So I only want it to be created on that particular date time offset. Then I can say by modified between. And here you can see in this particular section, I'm passing in a tuple of date onlys for modified. So I can say modified dot start, modified dot end. And I don't have to care if modified itself is null, if the start or end is null. The extension method takes care of that for me. So I can even come in here and look and see if start not equal to null, then add it to the query. If end not equal to null, add it to the query. So if somebody wants to pass in something for modified, I can support both of those. Same with session. where's between? There it is. So I can say session.start, question.start, and session.end. And then if I want, I can even do the as enumerable to say I'm done querying the database. Everything from here on will be the C# querying it. But all I'm doing is mapping. So yeah, so the same kind of thing here. And just because these are queryable, actually they're queryable. So now the by's go away because it needs to be an I queryable, not an I enumerable. But I could do as queryable, and then I get those back. So even though I've now come out of the database, now I can still get back to using these extension methods if I change it to a queryable. So still does work. Just an extra call. But get rid of that. Basically, this allows me to compose a lot more things and use a lot more filtering where I just don't have to write it. I can just use these extension methods and off I go. That was a lot faster than having to go through and create all of these. Now, obviously, once they're created, you can reuse them and you don't have to worry about creating them again. So it's just an upfront cost, but this saves you even that upfront cost. So over here in this vehicle service, doing the same kind of thing, where I can do get vehicle. Oh, one thing I forgot to show you. Over here by get by ID, I am using the extension method to get by ID, and of course first by default. Here I'm doing the same thing, get vehicle by vehicle ID, but I'm just using the built-in repository methods here. Those still work fine, and we should use those where we can because it saves basically a minuscule amount of performance, but still a little bit of performance. In fact, small enough that it would probably even be hard to measure, but nonetheless, use these where we can, and then we can use the extension methods for anything else. So down here in this get vehicles, I'm actually gonna do this, make it easier to see. So I can do the same thing, dot by make, dot by model. If I can type by year, by serial, and serial should be unique, but we're going to pretend like, maybe it's not. Dot by created. Okay, so same kind of thing. Because those are generated for me, I just came in here and went ahead and used them. And I can create a very easily composable filter method to get just the vehicles I want, where the service is allowing me to do this, but I don't have to directly interact with the repository. So out here in my worker, get vehicles, I can say make Ford. So I'm still able to do the filtering I want, but I'm using this interface on the service, so I don't have to actually deal directly with the repository. So it still keeps the separations, the abstractions. So we have separation of concerns. We have, where I can replace this with something else if I want to later. I can replace the database with something else later, whatever I want. And this doesn't have to change. In fact, neither does this, unless I use a completely different class to implement it, but not really changing in that case, replacing. So I can do all these things. I can use these pre-made methods. It speeds things up, makes things easier to work with. Some of the things to make this work though. So let's look at our NuGet packages. To start with, we're going to need the stuff that we would normally have in here. Go to install, not updates. Where we've got, let's look at EF core. That's going to have to go to our data class. That's required because otherwise we don't get the data context stuff to work right. In memory, so I'm just doing that so that I have the in-memory version, and I don't need that in data because that doesn't care where the database is. I only have it here. So I can swap this out to SQL Server at some point if I wanted to. Dependency injection, which we're used to, logging, which we're used to. So everything, and then even AutoMapper, which again, we may switch this out to Mapster at some point, but that's all this stuff here is pretty normal, not anything that's abnormal for what we typically do. EFRepository though, you can see it's included in a lot of places. So we have it in the main project so that we can register the repository interface. We have it in the services, so again, we can use the repository interface. And we have it in data because this one package contains the interface to run all the normal repository pattern things, but it also contains the generators that we would use for the data class. So that's this piece here, this DLL, as if running as an analyzer, that exists inside this same package. So make sure that you are including it in whatever project has your DB context. Then the other thing is we need to make sure, so this is the service, you should be able to figure out that, I need a reference to the database because I'm using the EFR data stuff. Like this is from the database. I have to have this. So it should be obvious that I need a dependency on the data class. Okay, should be pretty obvious. That's cool that exists in here. Actually, I'll come back to that in a second. But because I need that data reference, you would think, well, I've made the reference, I've got to alias it because I've got my normal class user and I have my database user, so I want to use an alias db.efr.data. But if I don't have this other using statement here, yeah, I'm referencing it and I've got a using statement that technically has it, but now it doesn't know where to find these because I don't know, or it doesn't know that these things exist. So I have to have this in here to let it know where to find these. So if you ever start using these and you're like, well, why isn't it working? Make sure you have this using statement that tells it point to the DB context because it has to have that in there. So once you've got those, then it should just be a matter of .byname or whatever else you need to use to filter. A couple of things Visual Studio does. When you first install all that stuff, you'll probably need to do a build to get this stuff to show up. Sometimes the analyzers don't kick in immediately, and so you won't see anything. If you're ever not sure, you can come look in analyzers, look under our generator, and if you see something like this, the generator is not generating files, then what that means is it hasn't found anything to run. So you may need to do a build to get it to find what it needs. It also could be that Visual Studio is having some issues. Even though I had all this set up, it was running, it was building. As soon as I added something new, in fact, no, because I added score. Sometimes when you add something new, let's say we're storing their account balance. So if I now come in here and say .by account balance, yeah, this time it found it. So sometimes what that'll do is say, oh, I can't find that because it's just being generated and the build somehow gets confused and it doesn't really know what to do. So you need to keep an eye out for that. If that happens, where you're sure you have the using statement, it shows that it's generating the classes. You can see them in there. You got the right namespaces. Everything looks good. Just try restarting Visual Studio. For whatever reason, sometimes it gets into a state where it just can't do what it's supposed to do, and that usually fixes it. So keep that in mind. You'll notice that we do have this analyzer included because of the reference to EFR.data. So the generator is going to run in every project that it's included in. Technically, I could probably just include it in the data, and then these service projects would get the EF repository reference by virtue of the fact that they include that, and likewise with the EF repository, or entity framework, sorry. But I like to have my references be explicit, and it's still just one DLL that gets copied anyway, so we should be okay. But if you do have a DB context inside here, then this class will also start generating files. Hopefully you don't have one DB context depending on another, though. I'm sure there are use cases for it, but none that I can think of off the top of my head, so shouldn't be something we come up with. Oh yeah, the logger. Not really sure why it's doing that. But we can come in here. Let's see, I don't think I've broken anything that's going to cause this to not work anymore. But just to show you that it does actually run, build succeeded. And we're going to put some stuff into the database. There it goes. So now we can run this to see if we can get the user by ID. And if we look here, we are using that extension method to do it in this particular case. Why are you not stepping over? Weird. Okay. Anyway, you can see we did get the user back. By ID was 2, and we did get user 2. So that extension method does work just fine. Likewise, here I'm doing like a modified to get, or I tuple for where the modified is between a particular date range. So I should get all the users that were modified within that range. Why is it not liking to? Huh, for whatever reason, we keep to move forward. Okay, well, we'll step over. We can do users. We can see we did get 3 back, where the date range for modified 3/1/2022 is between 4 days ago and 1 day from now. And when I create the users, I'm subtracting, let's see, from date time. So yeah, so add days negative. So for every user, I'm telling it was modified a day previous, which would technically put up before it was created, but let's just move on from there. Anyway, so yeah, from 4 days ago, we should expect to see only 3 results because that's by date, and I'm doing by between, not between and equals. So actually I could do that. Come in here. So rather than between, I could do dot by modified let's see, so greater would mean that it comes after. So I would want modified start. And then I could get rid of this, run it again. Stuff gets inserted. All right. Can I use my keyboard? All right, well, step over. Now we have 4 because now we're including the date that was the last day that we passed in. So yeah, anyway, modified. So that works. We can go ahead and let this run out. And yeah, that is our EF repository. So hopefully that gives you an idea to, or how to use this new project, new library, give you an idea of the kind of structure we want to see with this particular setup. Most projects should look similar to this. So anyway, hopefully that was helpful.